There is a fairly widely circulated opinion, which you will see on forums, that in unconditional surrender, it is much harder to play defense than it is to play offense. It's usually a response to players saying that it's impossible for the Soviet forces to hold against the German forces in Barbarossa. The answer comes back, oh well, you're only starting out at the game, you don't understand how to play defensively very well, and that's why you can't stop them. I think there's some truth in this, but I'm not convinced it's as true as the repetition of that suggests. What I'm not going to do today is spend a whole bunch of time talking about how you defend on the Eastern Front. In many ways, I think those kinds of operational analyses are probably the least useful things you can do, because they take for granted that you already understand all of the tactical details and that you understand where things fit within the grand strategic frame of the game. And of course, if you've only played half a dozen games, you don't understand either of those things. You're trying to have this discussion where you don't have the context or the tools to actually make sense of it. So what I'm going to do is isolate a very specific element of defense and talk about that. And the specific element I'm going to isolate is retreat paths. I'm going to be doing this again with screenshots that I've collected from a variety of different games as I've played them. You can see that the US 7th Armoured has just launched an attack, and it's caused a DR result for the German 14th Infantry. And when that happens, the German player has to decide which of those 3 hexes the 14th Infantry retreats to. This is one of only 2 active things that the defending player can do. They can decide whether or not to commit additional resources in the combat. Once the combat is resolved, they can decide where units retreat to. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will be able to see that some of these retreats are much better than others and know which one is which. So let's begin with the concept of isolation, which is a centrally important part of understanding retreats. Isolation is a bonus, a +2 dice roll modifier, which the attacker receives if the defender has no retreat and no adjacent friendly units or cities. And we can see in this relatively simple example here of a UK or US unit attacking an Italian infantry how much difference that makes. If you attack and you have a +1 dice roll modifier and the opponent doesn't, you have a 1 in 12 chance of causing a disruption, which is a step loss. Otherwise, the best you're going to get is a retreat. If you get an isolate, then you have a 1 in 4 chance of destroying the enemy unit. Note, destroying, not simply disrupting, because the enemy unit has nowhere to retreat to, and a DD result causes both a disruption and a retreat, and if you can't make a retreat, that turns into an additional step loss, and a 15 in 36 chance of causing a step loss of some sort. In other words, turning a standard combat into an isolate generally makes it 10 times more deadly for the opponent. It's one of the key things you need to avoid in defence. You need to stop your units becoming isolated, or at least delay the isolations as long as possible. So, let's look at a very simple example in North Africa. The Italian unit has just 2 hexes it can retreat to. That's a pretty straightforward situation. However, one of those hexes is an isolation trap. If the Italian unit retreats along the coast, which is an entirely reasonable thing to kind of intuitively do, fall back along the road. Then there is a British motorised unit at Gapes. It will have enough movement to come all the way down, swing round Tripoli, and isolate the Italian, pinning it against the coast, at which point the Italian unit is almost certainly dead. So the Italian unit has to, at this moment, retreat inland to avoid that elbow. Now, as it continues to retreat, there is a second elbow on the coast at hex 5430, but the Italian unit has to consider that before it actually gets to that hex. If it retreats back along the road, then the British Expeditionary Force will come round the outside and cut off the retreat into 5530 and then force it to retreat back into the trap. I started with Africa because Africa is always a much simpler example. The front is always about 2 hexes wide. But people do fall into these traps in Africa, and they kind of matter because usually the whole thing is hinging on whether one unit lives or dies. So these can be pretty fatal to your game. On more complex fronts, you generally want to retreat around, not away from your own units. So here we see the aftermath of a mistaken retreat. The 6th Guard has just finished its attack, and the German unit that it attacked has retreated to Berlin. Now, obviously, the 6th Guard is beyond its own supply lines, but that can be relatively easily fixed. The Germans had 3 retreat paths available to them, but the one they picked was clearly a mistake. The reason is that it's allowed Stettin to become isolated. Had the unit retreated northwest instead, then Stettin would not be isolated. Now note, Stettin would still be cut off. It still wouldn't be able to retreat, but the opponent would no longer receive the +2 bonus when attacking it. And the +2 bonus is important. It cancels the terrain effect of both the river and the city. By retreating to Berlin, the player has very likely doomed Stettin to being overrun. This would get a little bit more complicated if the 6th Guard had movement points left, because obviously retreating west, southwest and northwest all have different movement point requirements for a follow-up attack, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Generally speaking, as you are retreating, you retreat around your units so that your units form clumps. Clumps of units can still be destroyed because they don't have retreat spaces, but the opponent no longer gets the +2 isolate bonus. There are exceptions. In this case, the British had the Home Defence Force in the front line west of Antwerp. Let me just make this clear. Garrisons are a liability in lines. They give the opponent a place that they can punch through. If the garrison had not been there, the Germans could not have moved to that hex. Now in this case, the unit has moved round the 1st Infantry, which as a general principle is sound, but it's a really bad idea in this case. Remember, you can see the Germans are so confident in their ability to break through against the garrison that they actually put an airdrop marker underneath the 1st Infantry in advance with the intention of sweeping round and then surrounding it. If the home defence had retreated west to 2714, where it doesn't have a retreat, then it would have drawn the panzer out of position. It would have taken the panzer longer to come round and get to a position where it was cutting off Lille's retreat, and therefore it would have had fewer movement points available to launch its attack. Here's another one. 1st Para has retreated east, but it should have retreated northeast. Now, the reason for this is that it's not helping the unit at Dusseldorf. The unit at Dusseldorf has a panzer to its southeast. It isn't isolated. It might become isolated during the term, but the 1st Para isn't going to help that. What it is allowing is if the first armoured attacks the first para and forces out again, then the Dusseldorf unit is now surrounded, right, and has no retreat options. Force the 5th Panzer away and it becomes isolated. So I said we'd consider movement points, which we're going to do now. And this is an important thing to always take account of. Sometimes it's a little hard to keep track of. How many movement points does the attacking unit have left? Again, I said that garrison units are an active liability in defensive lines. Absolutely. Having a garrison unit in Dusseldorf here just makes it easier for the enemy to take Dusseldorf. The Allied 1st Canadian has 3 movement points left. How does this affect the retreat decision? Well, the answer is it means the 7th Garrison should retreat south of the river, because an attack across the river into rough terrain is going to cost 4 movement points, which means that it can't be attacked a second time. Just to illustrate how bad retreating east is, in the open, there is a 9 in 36 chance that the garrison will simply blow up. If it blows up, then a no enemy zone of control marker goes on the space. The 1st Canadian moves in and then gets a point of movement afterwards, and the 5th Panzer is now isolated. If you go southwest, you cut off the other garrison's best retreat space. You force it to retreat southeast into open territory, where it becomes a liability for the 15th Infantry. Remember, it could be destroyed, in which case you create the potential for encirclement. Let's have a look at another one. 2nd Panzer has 6 movement points left. The Polish unit is badly hurt. Its chances of successfully defending here are slim. The question we're asking is, what gives it the best chance? Retreat northeast, east, or southeast? Well, let's look at the combat results. Here are the odds on the next combat. You will notice that if the Polish unit is defending Krakow, it does not matter what the Germans roll. They are going to force a retreat and they're going to take the city. If the Polish unit also had, as well as rough terrain or a city, a barrier such as a mountain hexside or a river hexside, then there would be a slim 1 in 36 chance of it holding, and slightly less chance of it just blowing up as a result of the attack. The unit needs to retreat southeast. The southeastern retreat means that the Panzer will need 4 movement points to attack it. That means only 1 attack. And there's a chance of the attack not succeeding. Southeast gives you a 1 in 36 chance of holding Krakow. Any other retreat makes the loss of Krakow a certainty. When you're doing this, count carefully and weigh the risks. This is a Battle of France game. I'm hoping it's obvious why the French 7th Infantry would not want to retreat to the southeast. The German unit has 6 movement points left, and that means it's going to get 2 attacks, whether the French retreat west and are attacked in the open, or whether they retreat southwest and are attacked across the river. The German unit's going to get an attack, and then if it retreats again, it's going to get a subsequent attack. I've marked in the different positions. Let's look at the combat table. You'll see that the river makes a very big difference. First of all, it eliminates the DD result, and it reduces the chance of a retreat to just 7 in 36. Do those calculations, but also be realistic when you're doing them. If the unit retreats west, then what it is doing is it is continuing to cut the supply to the 1st Panzer. And it's holding the line with the 2nd Infantry in Antwerp. But some realism is required here. You're going to be attacked in the open twice. If the 1st German unit fails, the 8th Infantry can come round and also attack you in the open. You're going to have to survive at least 4 consecutive attacks in the open. Your chances of doing so are 1 in 5 at best, and there's a very real possibility of taking a defender disruption, this section of the front collapsing, the British Expeditionary Force being cut off, and Antwerp falling. You probably can't save Antwerp anyway, so concern yourself with trying to protect the British Expeditionary Force, which is in a position to exploit the supply trap that the German 16th Infantry has fallen into just below the Maginot Line. You also need to consider the potential your retreat has to put the unit in a position that interferes with the opponent's future plans. And by the way, you should be considering this if you are attacking as well. So here's a good example. The Polish unit, because of the sequencing, can retreat to the east, even though it contains a German unit. Ground units stop retreats. Air units do not. If the Polish unit retreats into this space, then the 4th Luftwaffe has to rebase. When it does so, it loses a sortie. So that's a useful rule to remember. It's also something to bear in mind when you are doing a retreat. This is a more complicated one. The 2nd Panzer has attacked down into the Russian forces that are managing the encirclement. But in doing so, it has forced the infantry back into the Pripyat marshes. Now, there were a whole bunch of options available to this infantry unit, which I've marked on the board. Some of those options were much more likely to keep the unit alive. But this option closes the escape route for the 4 German units in the marsh. Those German units could simply have walked out if they had done so before the 2nd Panzer launched its attack, and thus escaped the encirclement. Now that the Russian infantry is in the way, they can't just walk out. There are zones of control blocking them. Now, as actually happened in this game, they will almost certainly be able to destroy the Russian unit, but it took multiple attacks, and it meant that none of those units were able to retreat any significant distance. They were all still stuck as a pocket in the marsh, and they were then enveloped again on the next turn. Eventually, the units were destroyed in the envelopments. Think about supply traps when you are deciding on your retreats. Here I'm showing you a retreat that happened from Dijon, in which I made a mistake. The unit had 3 options to retreat. The panzer that was attacking it was out of movement points, so it didn't matter where it retreated to, it wasn't going to be attacked a second time. Had it retreated southwest, there would still have been a hole in the line through which a German unit could have come to occupy Vichy. But because the German units were coming from deep in the rear in order to do that, it wouldn't have been possible for the supply line to have been held open by the infantry unit that's currently west of that unit. So Vichy would have become a supply trap. And that would likely have protected it against any opponent good enough to spot that there was a supply trap. And if the opponent wasn't good enough to spot there was a supply trap, then on the French turn, they could probably have isolated and killed the unit at Vichy. Now, that isn't going to stop France from falling. I mean, France is pretty much doomed by this stage. But it ultimately costs the Germans a point of national will, and that makes a difference in the end game. So I need to talk a little bit about assaults. Assaults can sometimes work a little bit differently. So usually assaults work exactly the same way that ordinary attacks do. Here is an example. The second shock and the fourth shock did a combined assault against this unit. It retreats to there. The unit has already been pushed back once as a result of a combined assault by the first and the third shock. This is an example of using a rolling assault to actually make ground during a poor weather offensive. And as you can see, this will actually open some space to allow the Russian units to exploit. If you're looking at this, then obviously the German unit wants to retreat west, because if it doesn't, it opens a space that would allow the 10th Guard to get to Tallinn, take Tallinn, come back out, cut off a German unit, and of course the Russians would then just build a unit in the now liberated Tallinn. But it doesn't always work exactly the same way. If the Guard unit carries out its assault, then the German unit can retreat to Vilnius. Now, this is true of all attacks, because you can always retreat into a friendly city, even if it has an enemy zone of control operating over it. The exception being you have to move at least 1 hex away from your attacker. So, if instead of the Guard unit attacking, the 4th Shock moved to hex 2239 and launched an attack, then the 1st Infantry would not be able to retreat to Vilnius. It still wouldn't be isolated, it would still have a friendly city next to it, but it wouldn't be able to use that friendly city as a retreat space. Now, here's where the complexity comes. In an assault, if the 4th Shock and the 10th Guard attacked together, with one of them attacking and one of them counting as an additional attacker, then the 1st Infantry would be able to retreat to Vilnius, and it would not matter which unit was the primary attacker and which unit was the additional attacker. If it was a combined assault, the unit would be able to retreat. And the reason for that is that when a combined assault happens, the opponent gets to select which unit in the assault counts as the attacker for the purposes of having to finish 1 hex away from it. So this is a very common situation that occurs. People think they've got a unit trapped, they launch a combined assault, and the unit slips away into a nearby city. Let's finish by talking a little bit about the value of cities. There are some tactical tips in the playbook by the designer. And there's this little bit that says, sometimes it is better to defend in front of or beside a friendly city rather than directly in it. The tactical tip is not wrong, but because it doesn't specify what the sometimes is, it is slightly misleading, in that it is usually better to defend in the city rather than next to it. Let's have a quick look at this. So we'll start with a panzer in fair weather attacking a Russian infantry, or, if you want, a German infantry with air support attacking a Russian infantry. This is a very common battle. The dangerous thing are the DD and DE results. These are the things that really upset the day for Russian players, right? Because you're looking at something like a 13 in 36 chance of the unit either taking a step loss or just blowing up. Add in terrain and that drops to 9 in 36. That is, terrain drops the chances of this particularly devastating result by about a third. So that's a big difference. It also introduces a 1 in 36 chance of an attacker stopped result. Attacker stopped results are great. But don't forget the movement points. So let's look at this here with the German 15th Infantry attacking. This is not the attack the Germans would actually do, but it illustrates our point. A movement point to move into contact. It costs 4 movement points to then launch the next attack because it's across a river and into a city. Then, if it's successful, the Russian unit retreats across the river and it will cost a further 3 movement points to attack it again. And this movement point cost is enormously important. In the open, a motorised unit can attack 5 times. An infantry unit can attack 4 times. Put the defenders into cities or any rough terrain or rivers. This drops to 2 or 3 attacks. In other words, you're going to get 50% more attacks if the enemy are in the open. And those attacks are 50% more likely to result in really bad results, DDs or DEs. Combine that together and you're basically doubling the lethality of offensives if the enemy defend in the open. Defending units should be in cities. Ideally, and this is where beginning to think about defender retreats begins to feed into having a better understanding of defence overall. Ideally, your units are not just in cities or rough terrain or behind rivers. They are in spaces where they will be able to retreat to another space that is over a river or in rough terrain or in a city, so that consecutively the cumulative effect is to wear down the enemy's movement points and to reduce the chances of particularly bad results. So when is the sometimes? Well, obviously, poor and severe weather. In fair weather, it's almost never a good idea to defend next to or in front of a city if that means defending in the open. But once you're in poor or severe weather, part of the attacker's advantages are taken away in that they can only launch one attack rather than multiple attacks by spending movement points because they can only do assaults. And this situation we saw earlier with the Germans being encircled is a reasonable example of this. By positioning the units either side of the town, both units protect the town. It can't be taken until one of the units is dislodged. Neither unit counts as isolated, and if attacked with an assault from multiple directions, the units have a retreat space, so this greatly improves their survivability. However, what I would say is while this tactical tip in the playbook is correct, the sometimes that the sentence begins with is actually an edge case. Usually you want to be defending in a city. It costs the opponent an extra movement point. It gives you a defensive bonus as well. So here endeth the lesson, and that about wraps up my thoughts on retreat paths for the day. And as you can see, that actually took a bit of time to go through the possibilities with retreat paths. You can actually get quite complicated with some of these. The implications for an early retreat can be quite large as they affect lots of things happening around them on the same front. But understanding how to retreat is the beginnings of beginning to develop a good defence in unconditional surrender. And it's something that I notice both my own errors and errors by other players. Poor choice of retreat path is very common. In most of the examples I gave today, somebody picked the wrong retreat path, and that decision cost them, in some cases, an isolated and destroyed unit. If you've got any specific thoughts on any of the examples, or you think there's an additional point about retreat paths that I haven't covered, then feel free to discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you for the next one of these.